During the 600 years of the Catholic Inquisition, historians estimate that probably 500 million true Bible-believing Christians were martyred, as well as probably an estimated 4 million Jews and so-called accused witches, which we don't know the actual numbers, but the classic 1922 film Haxan estimates that there were 8 million people killed after being convicted as witches during the time of the Inquisition. But that's for witchcraft only, not heresy. Here in this video, I've included photographs of some of the torture devices that were used on heretics and designed by various Catholics during the time of the Inquisition, starting from Pope Innocent in the 12th century. And if there ever was an instance of doublespeak, it's naming this Pope naming himself Innocent. He should have called himself Pope Satan. But anyway, he decided that because he had an idle army left over from the Crusades, so he set them to work exterminating heretics. And his following popes all authorized the same use of deadly force on anyone who disagreed with them. The Pope ordered the complete extermination of both the Waldenses and the Albigenses because they had, and that's man, women, and children, because they had copies of the Bible. From the very beginning of the papacy, all the popes practiced genocide. As soon as the popes received power, popes slaughtered nations who wouldn't submit to their authority, hired armies of mercenaries to slaughter every man, woman, and child of each of these nations. The Vandals, the Ostrogoths, and Heruli. But it was this Pope, Innocent III, who initiated the office of the Inquisition. In 2000, Pope John Paul issued an apology, a so-called fake apology over the atrocities that happened during the Inquisition, dismissing it as saying it was the work of lower members of the church acting independently. But this is an absolute lie, because all the historical documents show that the popes themselves designed and devised these torture methods and approved and commanded the cardinals and the priests and all their followers to use these methods on the heretics and to torture them and use deadly force to exterminate anyone who didn't follow the Pope's wishes. I think personally this fake apology that the Pope issued really insults people's intelligence, because he honestly expects us to believe that a few lower officers of the church, or whatever you want to call them, were acting independently. That's not possible. It's not even plausible, because the Vatican is a pyramidal hierarchy with a centralized top-down structure, exactly like every other corporation, government, or organization that has a very, very strict code, and all the orders come from the top down. I think these sorts of things are more along the lines of not different priests or cardinals or bishops acting independently, but more like the mafia, and more like in the case of the Nazis in World War II, where everyone was just following orders. That's the case here. And so the Pope, again, denying responsibility for these atrocities is, well, I guess it's expected, but it's also a complete lie. As Peter de Rosa's book proves, independent thought is not allowed by the Vatican. That was the whole purpose of the Inquisition. It really is a sign of extreme arrogance to use such an obvious lie as an excuse, to say it was the act of a few lower church officers acting alone. Catholic canon laws say that the Pope must be obeyed, and all decisions are only to be made by him, not individual members of the church. Canon laws prove Pope believes that he is God on earth, so nobody even farts in the Vatican without his permission. The Vatican functions exactly like the original system it was designed as a copy of, the Roman Empire, which was a dictatorship. This feature really explains all the popes' behavior throughout history, how every single one of them has to travel to every dictatorship in the world, sign treaties with these monsters that encourage them to slaughter their own people, while holding hands with them and talking about world peace. Peter de Rosa, Catholic historian, in his book Vicars of Christ, describes that out of all popes, almost none of them disapproved of the methods of the Inquisition, and explains also that almost every pope in history continues the plans of his predecessor, no matter how evil or against God they actually are. During the Inquisition, any adult anyone, I guess an adult back then was anyone over 12 years old, was strapped to these various devices in which spikes with barbs on them were designed to pierce through their genitals and all their body orifices. And all these torture methods were designed to produce as much pain as possible. And again, these were all devised with the Pope's consent and under his direction. Now, this little beauty this instrument was known as the pear. And what it was used for was that the screw inside it would cause the fingers of the device to expand, progressively open. And this was inserted by priests and monks into heretics' body orifices and then progressively opened, causing incredible pain. This particular device was almost exclusively used on women. It was either placed inside their mouth or usually in their vagina, and then gradually expanded. And I would just like to ask you, in thinking about something like this, that such a preoccupation, these popes and priests seem to have an incredible preoccupation with inflicting pain on genitals and body orifices. And I would just ask you, do you honestly think that someone that's so holy, supposedly holy and close to God, would be so preoccupied and fascinated with mutilating genitals and bodily orifices? Now, the extermination of heretics is authorized under Canon 1311 in the Catholic Book of Canon Law, which states that any method of coercion, including deadly force, may be used to dispose of heretics. And if you think this still isn't in effect today, you're wrong. I'm reading this out of the 1983 copy of Canon Law, which I believe is the most recent one. The other evidence that the Vatican's mentality has, besides their fake apology, the other evidence that their mentality has not changed is in the recent past, in most of the 20th century, we see the same behavior as in Croatia. When Anton Pavlich came to power, he made a deal with the Pope that he would force all the Croatians to become Catholics. And so they slaughtered 900,000 Serbs, most of them who were Orthodox Christians, because they would not convert to Catholicism. And I think the 100,000 or so that promised to convert, when they were brought into the Catholic churches with the priests standing there before they renounced their faith, they were all executed. And remember, this is in 1941 to 45, and this is in pretty recent church history. So the other thing I'd like to add is the rationale and the thinking behind the residential schools in Canada is also here too. And residential schools existed until 1996. And now we see from the Canon 1311 why the priests and the nuns were allowed to abuse and in some cases starved and kill the native children because they were heretics. And basically any punishment, including torture and death, against heretics is permitted and even encouraged by Canon 1311. Note also that during the time period, during the conquest of both North and South America, the Catholic Church killed an estimated 30 million plus Native Americans. The popes of the Second World War and the 1930s also had treaties with Hitler, Franco, and Mussolini, in which he helped them secretly, which explains why the Catholic Church helped to sneak probably thousands of high-ranking Nazis out of Germany at the end of the war and helped ship them to Argentina through rat lines, while dressed as Catholic priests, of course. Anyway, if after looking all this up for yourself and seeing the pictures and seeing the proof in the history books, if there's any of you out there who don't believe by this point that the Pope is the Antichrist, which he is, then there's nothing I can do for you. No Vatican or church policy, either official or unofficial, ever happens without the Pope's complete knowledge and complicity. And I almost forgot, thanks to the Magdalene Laundries scandal, now in Ireland there are almost no Catholics in a country that used to be over 90% Catholic. Praise God! Remember, the popes of the Middle Ages devised all these torture methods to cause the most extreme pain, suffering, and death to those who would question papal infallibility. And don't be fooled. Just because the Pope's power to do this was taken away in 1798, don't think he wouldn't like to punish those who don't believe his authority now. Think of the scandals all the recent scandals in the last few years. Residential schools, Magdalene laundries, the bon secours, nuns, infanticides, priests, bishops, and cardinals all molesting altar boys, the atrocities, genocide in Croatia. All this is the Vatican showing its true character, what's hidden behind the false illusion and the deception that they propagate. Anyone who's within the Vatican is knowingly complicit and agreeing to these acts, despite whatever false statements they may make. Because as Amos 3:3 says, "Can two walk together without they being agreed?" The Vatican's convert or die policy that they've had for at least the last 1,000 years of history contradicts the Bible, which says to leave the vengeance to God, and shows the demonic character of the papacy. And the Pope is therefore the man of sin that Paul describes in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Both the Magdalene laundries and the residential schools existed until the late 1990s, so don't think we're talking about ancient history. This is in the recent past. Jesus tells us in Matthew chapter 7, if you want to know or discern the true character of something, look at its fruits. Well, these are the fruits of the Vatican. Torture and death. Papacy is one of the most expert users of doublespeak. When they burn a heretic, they would call it an act of faith. And their torture chamber is called the Holy Office. If you want to hear much more about this in detail, I recommend Richard Bennett's video. He's a former Catholic priest, and this is where I got some of this information. I will put up a link to Richard Bennett's video in the description, and I also recommend the book Vicars of Christ by Peter DeRosa. He explains in great detail about the Pope's authority over the Inquisition and the abuse of heretics throughout the Middle Ages. I recommend reading this book to explain the full details of how deep this actually goes. Peter DeRosa is an expert. I consider him an expert in the history of the Catholic Church because as a Catholic historian, he was given access to all the secret Vatican documents regular people are not allowed to see. Also, it's worthwhile to consider that the last Pope, Benedict, his previous job before he became Pope was he was head of the Office of the Inquisition. So this should be yet another indication that as soon as the Vatican can establish more Magdalene laundries, residential schools, and exterminate as many people who don't believe in the Pope's authority as possible, they will. Canon Laws 1311 and 752 both explain that the Pope believes he can use any methods to enforce his will upon people. The Bible describes the man of lawlessness in 2 Thessalonians 2:4, which says, "He will oppose and exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God." While in Revelation 17, verse 6, John describes, "I saw the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus." So John is describing the mass martyrdom of the real saints, the real believers, the real purpose of the Inquisition. Now, out of all the men in history, only the Pope has done these two things: proclaimed himself to be God, setting himself up in God's temple. He even calls himself the Vicar of Christ, which is blasphemy, because John chapters 14 and 15 say the Vicar of Christ is the Holy Spirit, not some sinful man who kills all his enemies and rejoices in their suffering as his underlings lock them into torture devices that gouges out their eyes and crushes their skulls. Revelation chapters 11, 12, and 13 all explain how throughout history Satan has used the papacy to kill the real church, and the Pope has killed at least 500 million real believers from the Inquisition on. So we see he is the man of sin described in the New Testament. Being fascinated by the, we'll say, genital mutilation and suffering of someone's perceived enemies today would be considered as evidence of psychopathy, not of holiness. And the Pope perfectly imitates the tyrants of ancient Rome when he does these things, as well as Hitler, with the exception being that at least Hitler didn't blaspheme God and slander God's name. Note also that in history, Hitler killed a fraction of the humans that the popes have killed, and yet only Hitler is the one that's singled out between them as a war criminal. Thankfully, David Koresh and the Heaven's Gate cult leaders were recognized for what they are long before they were allowed to do the atrocities that the popes have been allowed to do throughout history. Inquisition Part 2 is about the 20th century instance of the Inquisition, the genocide in Croatia.